Welcome back. This is part 3 on Islam and Islamic legal tradition. In Islam, similar to what we have seen for Judaism, everything is based on monotheism, the belief in one God. The fundament of Islam is the statement that there is no God but God, the statement you have in the calligraphy in front of you. From an Islamic perspective, this is the basis for all truth. But Islam does not consider itself the only true religion. Rather, the Quran affirms that every people has been given their prophets. Islam sees itself as the last in a long chain of divine revelations. According to Islamic tradition, monotheism was brought to Arabia by Abraham and his son Ismail, who is regarded as the forefather of the Arabs. Abraham is also considered the one who built the Kaaba in Mecca as the central place of worship for the one God. However, over the generations, the Arabs had lost sight of truth, turned away from monotheism, and indulged in idolatry. Instead of being the place of worship for the one God, the Kaaba was filled with countless idols over time. Mecca had remained a pilgrimage center, but what attracted pilgrims from all over the Arabian Peninsula were the idols that were venerated in and around the Kaaba. This was, according to Islamic tradition, the situation that needed to be redressed. This was the world into which, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad had been sent as God's messenger with the mission of restoring monotheism. For Muslims, Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, is the role model to follow. With what he taught and with the example he set through his actions, he provided the point of reference for how to go through life. This is what much of Islamic law and ethics is rooted in. In the Islamic profession of faith, the Shahada, the fundamental statement that there is no God but God, is immediately followed by a second statement, namely that Muhammad is God's messenger. What is for sure is that Muhammad has changed the course of world history. Let me give you a short overview. Who was Muhammad? In Islamic art, there are no statues and no icons of him. In mosques, you wouldn't find any altars dedicated to him. Muhammad wouldn't have allowed for it, for fear of becoming an object of idolatry, distracting from the oneness of God. In Islam, the focus is always on the one God. Nothing else can be an object of worship. Muhammad is no more than God's messenger. When he is represented, it is usually merely in the form of calligraphic inscriptions of his name, or of calligraphic descriptions of his character and physical appearance. Pictures of Muhammad are rare. They can only be found in tiny miniature paintings, mostly serving as illustrations in books. Here you have one of those rare examples, a miniature book illustration showing Muhammad as he preaches, but as you can see, it's very small. And probably I should have had it even smaller on my slide. This is another example showing Muhammad praying at the Kaaba in Mecca with his face covered by a veil. Muhammad was born in Mecca around 570 of our time into one of the most respected Meccan families, the Quraysh, though in an impoverished branch of this family. Early in his childhood, he lost both of his parents and grew up as an orphan raised by an uncle. As a young man, he started working as a trader, acquiring a reputation of exceptional trustworthiness. At the time, Mecca was one of Arabia's foremost centers of trade, located at the crossroads of important routes of caravan trade. Muhammad entered the service of one of the most successful businesswomen of Mecca, Khadija, for whom he led caravans to Syria. Long-distance trade flourished in Arabia at that time. Later, Muhammad and Khadija married and led a happy family life, raising their daughter Fatima. In Mecca, Muhammad was one of the few men still attached to the ancestral monotheistic faith, and he had the habit to retreat from time to time to a mountain cave in the surroundings of Mecca for prayer. During one of those retreats, when he was about 40 years old, Muhammad started to receive revelations. According to Islamic tradition, the angel Gabriel, Jibril in Arabic, appeared to him, ordering him to recite the verses he dictated to him, the verses that were to become the verses of the Quran, which is what you can see in the miniature painting on the slide. These revelations were to continue over the following years, their core message being a call for return to the monotheistic faith. At first, Muhammad was afraid and reluctant to accepting any mission of a prophet, but encouraged by his wife Khadija, who according to Islamic tradition was the first person to embrace Islam, he started spreading the call for return to the monotheistic faith. Gradually, he built a small but growing community of followers willing to adopt the message he conveyed. However, Muhammad's affirmation of monotheism and his criticism of idolatry were perceived as a threat by the long-established Meccan families. The pilgrims who came from all over Arabia to the Kaaba to worship the many idols assembled in and around the sanctuary were good business, and Muhammad's message appeared to put that business at risk. This caused growing tensions between Muhammad and his community on the one hand, and the long-established Meccan families on the other. Over time, these tensions had reached a point when Muhammad's and his followers' lives were in danger. In this situation, Muhammad took the decision to leave Mecca and to emigrate with his community of Muslims to the oasis Yathrib, today's Medina, where a community of local Muslims were waiting for them. Noticing his departure, the Meccans chased him, but hiding in a cave with one of his companions, Abu Bakr, Muhammad escaped. Arriving in Yathrib, Muhammad started to build his community of Muslims into an independent political entity, establishing a social order along Islamic principles. Thus, the emigration to Yathrib, which is referred to as the Hijra in Arabic, marks the beginning of the establishment of Islamic society, of the community of believers, the Ummah in Arabic. In early Islamic history, the Hijra was a decisive turning point, a watershed event, which is why it also became the starting point for the Islamic calendar. In the Islamic calendar, years are counted as years from the Hijra. In the following years, the Meccans launched several military campaigns to crush the Muslim community in Yathrib, which posed a threat to their trade routes towards the north. A number of famous battles were fought, some won by the Muslims, others by the Meccans. But gradually, more and more tribes throughout the Arabian Peninsula joined Yathrib and embraced Islam. In the face of Muhammad's vast network of allies, the Meccans grew increasingly isolated. In the end, they were left with no other choice than to render their city to Muhammad. In 630 of our time, Muhammad and his companions, after having entered the city without fighting, took over Mecca, cleared the Kaaba from all idols, and returned the sanctuary to the worship of the one God, thus restoring monotheism in Mecca. Ever since, the Kaaba in Mecca is the geographical heart of the Islamic world. When 2 years later Muhammad died, the Muslim community elected Abu Bakr as his successor, his caliph, Khalifa in Arabic. Abu Bakr in turn was followed by other companions of the Prophet. The next was Umar, then Uthman, and finally Ali. These 4 first successors at the head of the Islamic community are referred to as the 4 rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidun in Arabic. In the Islamic tradition, Muhammad's time and the time of the four rightly guided caliphs are considered the time when Islam was at its nearest to perfection, a level never attained again later in Islamic history. During the reign of the Rashidun, the Islamic world expanded rapidly at the expense of the Byzantine and the Persian empires, whose rule was widely unpopular in the Middle East and North Africa at the time. However, this didn't mean immediate conversion of the population to Islam. In fact, Muslims remained a minority for quite some time. Conversion was a long and also incomplete process. Until today, there are still important other religious communities in the Middle East and in Egypt, namely Christians. Under the third Caliph Uthman, the Quranic verses, which until then had been transmitted in separate pieces of written text, were systematically collected and brought into the final order they assume in the Quran as we know it today. From an Islamic perspective, the Quran is divine revelation. It was not composed by Muhammad, but merely received by him, dictated to him word by word. The Quran is not only admired for its content, but also for its language, including every detail of its wording, and especially for its sound when recited. The Arabic word Quran literally means recitation, and Quran recitation is a highly developed art in the Islamic world. The fundamental importance of the Quranic text is underlined by the fact that it gave rise to one of the most prominent expressions of Islamic art, the art of calligraphy, which is not only to be found in splendid Quran manuscripts, but also omnipresent in Islamic architecture, where it compensates for the absence of statues and images. And last but not least, in Islamic law, the Quran is considered the highest source of law. The Rashidun were followed by two dynasties of caliphs reigning over the entire, or almost the entire Islamic world, the Umayyads and the Abbasids. The Umayyads governed from Damascus. The picture shows the Umayyad mosque in Damascus dating back to that time. The Umayyad Caliphate saw a continued expansion of the Islamic world, which had reached now the Indus River and Central Asia to the east and Spain to the west. The Abbasids governed their vast caliphate from Baghdad, a new city they had founded and built from scratch. Baghdad soon grew into what was the largest city of the world at the time and one of the most important centers of science and culture. Baghdad attracted the Islamic world's leading scholars in a wide range of sciences, including medicine, optics, mechanics, algebra, geography, astronomy, philosophy, and law. A huge amount of knowledge was concentrated in Baghdad's big libraries. You can see one in the picture. And look at how focused and engaged the scholars in this library are in their scientific discussion. Isn't that a perfect example to follow? In Umayyad and Abbasid times, Islamic civilization flourished, even though from the beginning, politics were often a mess, with struggles for power, dynastic intrigues, political murders and internal wars, as well as a widening rift between Sunni and Shia Islam. To be sure, there were a number of caliphs who are remembered as exemplary rulers, but for the most part, those were troubled times in terms of politics. However, life in society remained remarkably stable, despite all the political turmoil that was going on in the background. In terms of culture, Islamic Spain became a particularly flourishing part of the Islamic world, not only for Islamic but also Jewish culture, as we have seen in part 1 of this lecture. with cultural centers such as Córdoba and Toledo. From the 11th to the 15th century, large parts of the Islamic world, especially Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East, experienced several waves of foreign invasions, namely by Turkish Seljuks and Mongols. The Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries brought additional trouble for the Middle East, with large-scale massacres following the Crusaders' conquest of Jerusalem, where much of the Muslim and Jewish populations of the city perished, which is in stark contrast to what the historical records tell about the later recapture of Jerusalem by Sultan Saladin, when the Christian population was treated generously. In the Middle East, the Crusades are still remembered as an invasion, an attack by foreigners. However, the Crusades were not only a period of intense fighting, but also a time of cultural exchange. The picture shows a Christian and a Muslim commander who meet between the battles to play chess. In early modern times, large parts of the Islamic world were controlled by three large empires: the Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Safavid Empire in Persia and Central Asia, and the Mughal Empire in India. Because of their use of artillery for the military control of their vast territories, these empires are sometimes referred to as Gunpowder Empires. However, despite their impressive geographical dimensions, these empires came increasingly under pressure in their competition with European powers that had started their overseas expansion. In the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, much of the Islamic world came under European colonial rule, with the related economic exploitation and civilizational domination. The colonizers also saw the introduction of modern European-style systems of law as part of their civilizing mission. In the face of the modernity imposed on them by their colonial masters, Islamic societies reacted both with adaptation and resistance. Western ideas, concepts, and rules penetrated. Ancestral Islamic culture, which came to be perceived as inferior, started to be increasingly disregarded. Cultural uprooting began to be rampant. At the same time, first attempts were made to transform Islamic identity into a modern political ideology, a political weapon, which led to the emergence of early forms of Islamism, or political Islam, as it is also referred to. The experience of inferiority to the West has left deep wounds in the Islamic world and prepared the ground for the germination of radical ideologies, all the more so as cultural uprooting has weakened orientation. All of this did not end with decolonization. In many respects, modernization and westernization went on in the post-colonial states of the Islamic world. Cultural uprooting intensified. Attempts at instrumentalizing religion for political ends did not stop. Additionally fueled by the unresolved Israel-Palestine conflict and Western military campaigns perceived by many as new Crusade-style intrusions and invasions, Islamist ideologies continued to unfold, producing ever new versions of Islamist extremism, with terrorist acts being perpetrated that, like suicide attacks targeting civilians and sanctuaries, are in complete contradiction to the principles of Islamic law and ethics. Here is just one recent example: Sri Lanka attacks on Easter Sunday church services and hotels, killing over 250 and wounding at least 500. And what is even more worrying is that such acts are actually applauded by some, even though a majority abhors them. In many ways, Islamism is part of a modernization crisis that has less to do with Islam than with modern politics, modern economic and social developments and related frustrations. Looking at the biographies of Islamist terrorists, It is striking that many of them are people educated at modern universities, for example as engineers or doctors. But deeper roots in Islamic culture and tradition, which could provide a source of orientation, are regularly absent. These are not people who have been stuck in the Middle Ages. Their methods for planning and executing attacks and instrumentalizing the media are highly modern, which doesn't make it less frightening, of course. In all these respects, there are striking parallels between Islamist and Zionist extremism. A case in point is the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre perpetrated by a Zionist extremist who was a doctor with a university education from the US, which didn't prevent him from being involved in radical Zionist settler groups and finishing his career by entering the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron with his assault rifle at a time when around 800 Muslims had gathered for prayer near the tombs of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, opening fire on the worshippers, killing 29 and wounding another 125 before being overwhelmed and beaten to death. The vast majority in Israel was horrified. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin condemned the attack and spoke of the perpetrator in these words: "Sensible Judaism spits you out. You placed yourself outside the wall of Jewish law. We say to this horrible man and those like him, you are a shame on Zionism and an embarrassment to Judaism." The Sephardi chief rabbi said, "I am simply ashamed that a Jew carried out such a villainous and irresponsible act." Ashkenazi chief rabbi called it a desecration of God's name. Some, however, applauded. Hundreds traveled to the terrorist's grave that was turned into a kind of a pilgrimage place. And a few rabbis even tried to justify the massacre on the basis of distorted interpretations of Jewish law. Zionist extremism poses a mortal threat to Judaism, and Islamist extremism poses a mortal threat to Islam. Let me quote King Abdullah of Jordan. "These criminal groups thrive by pitting neighbor against neighbor, East against West, faith against faith. They have launched a murderous assault not only on our people's lives, but on the very fabric of our civilized world. These criminals are Khawarij, outlaws to our faith. People nowadays talk about fake news. The Khawarij produce fake Islam. They selectively paste together the words of Islamic texts to promote a false and perverted ideology. In reality, everything they are, everything they do, is a blatant violation of the teachings of my faith. In its essence, Islam is inclusive, not exclusivist." This is a BBC report on Ghana's chief imam attending a Catholic church service as part of his birthday celebrations when he turned 100 years old. This was on Easter Sunday 2019, the day when Islamist suicide bombers unleashed their attacks in Sri Lanka. The contrast couldn't be starker. Let me now turn to the classical Islamic worldview, and more specifically to the cosmological and anthropological foundations of Islamic law. First of all, the classical Islamic worldview is based on the doctrine of the oneness of God, Tawheed in Arabic, a word derived from the number one, Wahid in Arabic. In Islam, the fundamental statement that there is no God but God is understood as implying that there is no reality but the one reality. From this perspective, there cannot be any reality outside the highest reality that is the source of all being. Accordingly, the world is seen as a manifestation of the one God, the one manifested through multiple phenomena. In Islamic art, geometric designs, as the one in the picture, are an image for this worldview. While showing great variety and complexity, all elements of the pattern remain attached to a geometrical center, which by repeating itself in various shapes throughout the pattern is in fact everywhere. The underlying unity we can feel when looking at the pattern reflects a Quranic verse saying that wherever you turn, there is the face of God. Let me quote from Sayyid Hossein Nasr's book on the heart of Islam. At the heart of Islam stands the reality of God, the One, the Absolute and Infinite, the infinitely good and all-merciful, the One who is at once transcendent and immanent, greater than all we can conceive or imagine, yet as the Quran attests, closer to us than our jugular vein. The one God is the central reality of Islam in all of its facets, and attestation to this oneness, which is called Tawheed, is the axis around which all that is Islamic revolves. Allah is beyond all duality and rationality, yet He is the source of all existence, as well as the end to whom all things return. Striving after realization of that oneness or Tawheed is the heart of Islamic life. And to realize Tawheed means not only oneness, but also the integration of multiplicity into unity. In the Islamic perspective, the oneness of God has as its consequence not the uniqueness of prophecy, but its multiplicity, since God, as the infinite, created a world in which there is multiplicity. The multiplicity of races, nations, and tribes necessitates the diversity of revelations. Therefore, the Quran asserts that to every people we have sent a messenger. Before modern times, Islam was the only revealed religion to have direct contact with nearly all the major religions of the world. It had met Judaism and Christianity, the Iranian religions such as Zoroastrianism, Hinduism and Buddhism in Eastern Persia and India, the Chinese religions through the Silk Route. Centuries ago, Zoroaster and Buddha were common household names among Muslims of the eastern lands of the Islamic world, especially Persia. Indian Muslims had come to know of Krishna and Rama 1,000 years ago. Chinese Muslims knew the Confucian classics, and many considered Confucius and Lao Tzu prophets. The global nature of the religious knowledge of a learned Muslim sitting in Isfahan in the 14th century was very different from that of a scholastic thinker in Paris or Bologna of the same period. On the basis of the Quranic doctrine of religious universality and the vast historical experience of a global nature, Islamic civilization developed a cosmopolitan and worldwide religious perspective. This global vision is still part and parcel of the worldview of traditional Muslims, of those who have not abandoned their universal vision as a result of the onslaught of modernism or reactions to this onslaught in the form of what has come to be called fundamentalism. Have you heard of Amadou Hampâté-Bâ? He was probably the most famous West African Muslim scholar and writer of the 20th century, widely read, namely in French-speaking African countries and France. Amadou Hampâté-Bâ famously used to compare the different religions to as many different paths leading up to the top of the same mountain. But what is the place that is attributed to human beings in the Islamic worldview? According to the teachings of Islam, human beings are created by God and endowed by Him with an intelligence that gives them the means to return to God by realizing Tawheed, the oneness of God, which in fact they carry deep within themselves in their hearts. An inner journey that is also referred to as the return to one's inner center, one's inner Kaaba. Seen from this angle, The here and now, the world, appears to be just a transit place. Or in the words of Al-Ghazali, a celebrity among the scholars of Baghdad in Abbasid times, a caravanserai on the way towards God. Yet to truly embrace the oneness of God is to surrender to his will, which is actually the literal meaning of the word Islam. As Muslims see it, God's will is expressed in two ways. On the one hand, in one's personal fate, which is to be accepted as determined by God, and on the other hand, in God's commandments, which are to be followed with sincerity. And here we are at the starting point of Islamic law, which is understood as flowing from God's commandments. As you can see, this corresponds exactly to what we have found when looking at the Jewish legal tradition. Just as all commandments, all mitzvot that flow from the written and the oral Torah together form the halakha, in the same way, Islamic law, the Sharia, also consists of the entirety of the divine instructions for the way of life in Islam. The Islamic Sharia is the precise counterpart of the Jewish halakha.